The Stone Age. Before armies, before empires, and before humans even discovered metal, the first weapon was something incredibly simple. A rock. Just a rock picked up from the ground. But the moment early humans started using it, everything changed. A stone wasn't just a stone anymore. It has become a tool for hunting or survival. Over time, people learned to shape stone into sharper and more effective weapons. Hand axes and stone blades gave them an advantage they never had before. But there was one major problem. All of these weapons required you to get close to the animal, close to the enemy. Then came the spear, and the spear changed everything. For the first time, humans could keep danger at a distance. They could hunt, fight, and defend themselves without getting as close as before. It was simple, effective, and for thousands of years, one of the most important weapons ever created. Then came another breakthrough, the bow and arrow. Now range became the advantage. You didn't have to be the strongest person anymore. With enough skill and accuracy, you could strike from far away. And that's a lesson that repeats throughout history. The most powerful weapon isn't always the one that hits the hardest. Sometimes it's the one that reaches the target first. Then came the Bronze Age. Weapons were no longer just things people found in nature. They were things people intentionally created. Bronze gave humans stronger and more reliable weapons than stone. Bows became more effective, swords began appearing on battlefields, and war started becoming more organized. Then came war chariots, fast, mobile, and dangerous. Battles were no longer just groups of people running at each other. They became more strategic, more coordinated, and far more deadly. The Bronze Age didn't erase the weapons that came before it. It improved them, and for the first time, warfare became more than a person holding a weapon. It became a system. The Middle Ages. Imagine you're a knight wearing a full suit of armor, steel covering almost every part of your body. You feel protected, almost unstoppable. Then you discover that somewhere out there, people are already building weapons designed specifically to break that confidence. That was the Middle Ages. Not just castles, knights, and colorful banners. It was a constant race between protection and penetration. Every time armor became stronger, weapons evolved to get through it. One of the most famous weapons of this era was the English longbow. At first glance, it looked simple. Just a long piece of wood with a string. But in the hands of a trained archer, it became one of the most feared weapons on the battlefield. An experienced bowman could fire arrows over long distances and keep shooting at an incredible rate. One archer was dangerous. Hundreds of archers working together were something else entirely. The sky itself could seem filled with arrows. What started as a weapon became a wall of pressure moving toward the enemy. One of the best examples was the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. The longbow played a major role in slowing and disrupting heavily armored French knights, not because it was some magical superweapon, but because it worked together with something even more important: tactics, positioning, mud-covered ground, and disciplined soldiers who knew exactly what they were doing. The lesson was simple. A weapon is only as powerful as the strategy behind it, but the Middle Ages weren't fought only in open fields. Much of warfare revolved around castles, massive stone walls, high towers, heavy gates, entire armies hiding behind defenses and essentially saying, "Come in if you can." For centuries, castles were some of the strongest military structures ever built, and because of that, attackers needed new solutions. That's where siege weapons entered the picture. Machines built for one purpose: breaking things that seemed impossible to break. The catapult and the trebuchet became some of the most powerful tools of medieval warfare. They could launch huge stones over long distances and smash them into walls again and again. A castle that once felt completely secure could slowly be turned into a pile of damaged stone. Sieges weren't usually won in a single day. They were battles of patience. Every impact weakened the defenses a little more. Every day increased the pressure on the people trapped inside. Then there was the ballista. Imagine a giant crossbow built for war. It launched heavy bolts with impressive force and accuracy. While catapults focused on destruction, the ballista could target soldiers, defensive positions, and important points on the battlefield with much greater precision. And then there was a weapon unlike anything else of its time: Greek fire, used by the Byzantine Empire, especially in naval warfare. To enemies, it must have seemed almost supernatural. Most fires can be extinguished. Greek fire was famous because that wasn't always easy. Traditional methods often failed to stop it. Imagine you're aboard a wooden ship in the middle of the sea. You expect arrows. You expect enemy soldiers. Maybe even a boarding attack. Instead, you're suddenly facing flames that refuse to disappear. The threat wasn't just the fire itself, it was the fear it created. By the end of the Middle Ages, warfare had become far more than men swinging swords at each other. It had become a contest of engineering, tactics, and innovation, because every new defense inspired a new weapon, and every new weapon forced people to rethink how they fought. The Gunpowder Era. There was a moment in history when castles that could stop armies for months, sometimes even years, began to lose their power. The reason was a small black powder known as gunpowder. It first appeared in China and was originally used for celebrations and fireworks, but eventually, it found its way onto the battlefield and opened an entirely new chapter in warfare. One of the earliest examples was the fire lance. It looked like an ordinary spear, but attached to it was a tube that could shoot flames or fragments over a short distance. By modern standards, it was primitive, but historically, it was revolutionary. It marked the beginning of the path that would eventually lead to firearms. Then came cannons. Early cannons were heavy, slow, and difficult to move, but their impact was impossible to ignore. Castles that relied on tall, thick walls suddenly faced a completely different threat. Not arrows, not stones launched from siege engines, but powerful projectiles smashing into their defenses again and again. Over time, this changed the very design of fortifications. High walls were no longer enough. Strongholds became lower, thicker, and built to withstand artillery fire. The world had entered the age of gunpowder. As cannons spread, handheld firearms began appearing on battlefields. Weapons like the arquebus and later the musket were slow to reload and often inaccurate compared to modern firearms. But they transformed warfare in a different way. You no longer needed years of training to become a skilled archer. Entire formations of soldiers could be trained to fire in coordinated volleys, and that changed everything. Military power was no longer centered around legendary warriors or elite fighters. It became a matter of production, ammunition, discipline, and numbers. The Gunpowder Age transformed war from a test of individual skill into a machine powered by organization. The nations that could manufacture more weapons, train more soldiers, and sustain their armies for longer gained the advantage. For the first time, victory depended not only on who fought the hardest, but on who could build, supply, and endure. Industrial Era. And this was the moment when warfare began to shift from the power of a single weapon to the power of an entire factory. After the age of gunpowder, the world didn't stop at cannons and early firearms. The 19th century opened an entirely new chapter. Industry entered warfare and slowly started changing everything. At first, the changes weren't dramatic, but over time, their impact could be seen on every battlefield. Rifles became more accurate and more reliable, especially with the introduction of rifled barrels. These grooves inside the barrel made bullets spin as they traveled, improving stability, increasing range, and making shots far more precise. Artillery also evolved. Cannons became more powerful, more accurate, and capable of striking targets at greater distances than ever before. Ammunition that once took time and effort to produce could now be manufactured on a massive scale. What was once limited became abundant, but the transformation wasn't only about weapons. Armies themselves began to change. Railroads allowed nations to move soldiers, weapons, supplies, and equipment across huge distances with unprecedented speed. A journey that once took weeks could now take days. At the same time, the telegraph revolutionized communication. Commanders could send orders and receive updates across vast distances in a matter of minutes, something that would have seemed impossible only a few generations earlier. Warfare was no longer simply one army meeting another on an open field. Entire nations were now involved. Factories produced weapons. Railways moved armies. Ports handled supplies. Workers supported production. Commanders coordinated operations from far away. War was becoming larger, more organized, and more complex than ever before. This era also introduced technologies that hinted at the future of combat. More powerful explosives appeared. Early machine guns began making their first appearances. They were still in their infancy, but they offered a glimpse of what was coming next. What's interesting is that the Industrial Age rarely gets the same attention as the world wars that followed. Yet without this period, those conflicts would have looked completely different. This was the bridge between the old world and the modern battlefield, between a soldier carrying a simple rifle and an entire front line operating like a massive machine. In many ways, the Industrial Age changed the most important question in war. It was no longer simply, who has the better weapon? The question became, who has more factories, faster railroads, greater production, and a stronger ability to turn war into a system that never stops? World War I. This war was a shock to the world. Nations entered the conflict with old ideas about warfare, but they were about to face technologies that had changed the battlefield completely. In 1914, many people imagined war as fast-moving offensives, courageous charges, colorful flags, and decisive victories. But the Western Front told a very different story. Soldiers found themselves trapped in vast networks of trenches stretching across the landscape. Mud filled the ground. Barbed wire covered the approaches. Constant shelling turned entire regions into devastated wastelands. Open fields battlefields that once seemed easy to cross became deadly obstacles, where even small advances could come at a tremendous cost. Among all the weapons used during the war, artillery had perhaps the greatest impact. Massive guns fired shells for hours and sometimes even days without stopping. The goal was not only to destroy enemy positions but also to exhaust the soldiers defending them. The endless explosions created a battlefield unlike anything seen before. The physical destruction was enormous, but the psychological pressure could be just as devastating. Then came the machine gun. It became one of the defining weapons of the conflict and made direct assaults far more difficult. A single defensive position, if properly organized and protected, could stop large numbers of attacking soldiers in a very short time. This wasn't because the attackers lacked courage. Many soldiers showed extraordinary bravery. The problem was that technology had advanced faster than military tactics. Armies were still trying to fight with ideas from an earlier era, while modern weapons were forcing completely new rules onto the battlefield. As a result, the war turned into a long struggle of attrition. Both sides searched for ways to break through enemy lines, but every gain often came at a heavy price. Progress was measured not in miles, but sometimes in yards. Then another terrifying element entered the war: poison gas. Weapons such as chlorine gas and mustard gas introduced a new kind of fear. Soldiers no longer worried only about the enemy they could see. Now they had to fear the air around them. Wind direction became critical. Gas masks became essential equipment. Quick reactions could mean the difference between survival and disaster. These weapons left severe physical injuries and long-lasting psychological scars. Their effects became one of the clearest examples of why many people later argued that warfare needed limits and restrictions. By the end of World War I, the old image of war had been shattered. The romantic ideas of glorious charges and heroic battles had been replaced by industrialized conflict. Trenches, artillery, machine guns, mass production. The world had learned a difficult lesson. Once technology enters warfare, it doesn't simply improve it. It changes everything. After World War I, the world had already learned that modern war could be devastating. Millions of lives had been lost, entire regions had been destroyed, and nations were left struggling to recover. But despite everything that happened, World War II would push warfare to a level few people could have imagined. This wasn't simply a larger version of the previous conflict. It was faster, more widespread, and far more destructive. The battlefield was no longer limited to the front lines. War now reached deep into cities, factories, ports, railways, and the everyday lives of civilians. Entire nations became part of the conflict, whether they were soldiers or not. One of the defining features of this new era was military aviation. For the first time in history, the skies became one of the most important battlegrounds. Aircraft were no longer used only for reconnaissance. They became powerful weapons capable of striking targets far behind enemy lines. Strategic bombing campaigns aimed to weaken an opponent's ability to continue fighting. Factories were targeted because they produced weapons. Railways were targeted because they moved supplies and troops. Ports were targeted because they connected nations to resources and reinforcements. The goal was no longer just to defeat an army. It was to disrupt the entire system supporting that army. Across Europe, many cities experienced heavy bombing that caused widespread destruction and significant civilian casualties. Buildings, infrastructure, and industries were damaged on a massive scale. In Japan, the situation became even more severe in certain areas because many urban neighborhoods were built with materials that were highly vulnerable to fire. This made incendiary bombing especially destructive. One of the most significant examples was the firebombing of Tokyo, which became one of the deadliest conventional air raids in history. Entire districts were consumed by flames, demonstrating how destructive modern warfare had become even without nuclear weapons. Yet all of this happened before the event that would permanently change humanity's understanding of military power. In August 1945, the atomic bomb was used in warfare for the first time. The city of Hiroshima became the first target. Within a very short period of time, the city was transformed. The destruction was caused not only by the blast itself, but also by the intense heat and the long-term health effects that followed. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. At that moment, the world realized that warfare had entered an entirely new era. For thousands of years, military power had been measured by armies, fleets, fortifications, and industrial production. Now a single weapon had demonstrated the ability to devastate an entire city. The scale of destruction was unlike anything that had come before. World War II forced humanity to confront a new reality. Technology had reached a point where its power could extend far beyond the battlefield. The same innovations that drove scientific progress could also create weapons capable of threatening entire populations. It was a moment that changed not only warfare, but the way the world thought about the future itself. Humanity spent thousands of years building deadlier weapons, from sharpened stones to nuclear missiles. Each generation pushed the limits of what was possible, but by the Cold War, something had changed. For the first time, the deadliest weapons ever created were not designed to be used. They existed to prevent war through the threat of unimaginable destruction. The rock, the spear, the sword, the cannon, the machine gun, and the atomic bomb all followed the same path. More power, more range, more destruction. And by the end of the 20th century, humanity had reached a point where a single decision could affect the future of the entire planet. The evolution of weapons had reached its ultimate paradox. The deadliest weapons in history became the ones everyone hoped would never be fired.